This conference will now be recorded.
This is David Wiggins from George Mason University. I'm a member of the National Academy of Kinesiology, and I was elected into the National Academy of Kinesiology in 2007 with a number of 483. And I'm talking this afternoon with Scott Kretchmar. Scott is also a member of the National Academy of Kinesiology, elected into the organization in 1989 with the number 330. Scott was elected into the Academy the same year as two other well-known kinesiologists, Rod Dishman as well as Susan Greendorfer. And Scott is currently at Penn State University and is an internationally known philosopher of sport. Scott, first of all, thanks for doing this and talking with me this afternoon.
You're welcome, David. I'm glad to be here.
Let's start out this way. Where were you born and raised? And if you would, just discuss your early childhood experiences.
Well, I was raised in the Midwest. Cleveland, Ohio is where I was born. I was a war baby. My dad was colorblind, and that's relevant to where I was born because they wouldn't ship him overseas to be on a ship because he couldn't tell red from green, which they tell me is important if you're on the water. So he was in Cleveland, Ohio, guarding the port as a person in the Coast Guard when I was born. And my dad was an Oberlin College graduate, which many of you know is just west of Cleveland. And he ended up there as a professor when I was in the third grade. So we moved from Columbus, Ohio, where I grew up in the early school years, to Oberlin when I was in third grade. And my dad was a baseball coach and professor of what was then physical education at Oberlin College. They no longer have the major at Oberlin, which is a sore spot for me. But he was a highly respected coach. Baseball was his main game, but he also coached football and basketball and taught health education. My mother was an accomplished pianist and painter, an artist. She went to the Cleveland Institute of Art, and we had a grand piano in our living room, and I remember listening to her tinkle the ivories, as she would call it, and she was a wonderfully talented woman. So I guess my early childhood was torn between sport and art, and maybe some of those roots can be seen in some of the things I write and how I think, but I was lucky to have two wonderful parents and to have those influences as a child.
Tell me, did you have any brothers and sisters?
Yeah, I had two younger brothers. I was the oldest, so I think I fit the psychological stereotype of introvert, serious, intellectual in quotation marks, the kinds of things that the oldest child tend to be. My middle brother, the second brother, Dick, is a clown. Very humorous, much more fun to be around than I am. Totally different personality. I'm a mesomorph, ectomorph. He's an endomorph. We couldn't be more different. We wonder actually whether the genetic pool was the same, but we think it was. My youngest brother, Ted, is an educator in Texas, assistant principal down there. And I forgot to tell you that my brother Dick is a minister in Ohio.
Okay.
So he tells jokes from the pulpit. So we've got three boys, pretty well educated. I'm the only one who went all the way for the PhD and ended up doing academic kinds of things. But I had the misfortune of being born first in the birth order.
You mentioned to me that your father was a baseball coach. I assume he was probably also, in his younger days, a baseball player, but I also assume that you probably played the sport as well.
Yeah, at Oberlin, I played three sports. That tells you how old I am, because even at Division III schools now, athletes typically are recruited for one sport and train year-round for that sport. But in the good old days, as I say, at Division III schools like Oberlin, if you were athletically inclined, it was very common to play two sports, and I actually played three. Baseball was my main sport. I played on the varsity basketball team, and I ran cross country. So I went year round and had a marvelous time as part of the structure of my day. My father unfortunately died when I was a senior in high school. He got cancer, a major event in my life, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And so the irony was that year after he died as a coach at Oberlin, the baseball coach, I was a starting shortstop on the Oberlin team and played baseball, hoped I was going to be a professional baseball player. Blew out my arm my junior year. They moved me from shortstop where I might have had a shot to first base, and my body's not big enough for that. And so I decided to be an academic, not a hitter.
Let me just ask you also very briefly that you mentioned your two brothers, but could you just, I know that you have a couple of kids as well. Is that true?
Yeah, I have two children, Matthew and Jennifer, and I told both of them as they were growing up here in State College that they could not, under any circumstances, go to Penn State. That turned out to be a brilliant move on my part because both of them did go to Penn State and saved me a lot of money. But they're both very talented kids, and I don't want to brag for posterity about them, but Jen was a Division I basketball player here at Penn State and Phi Beta Kappa. And my son was a philosophy, math, computer science major here at Penn State. And both of them have PhDs, and neither one's writing home for money anymore.
and tell me, is your wife in academia as well?
She was a high school English teacher, retired 3 years ago. And so I would always run my papers by her for spell check. That was before the computers did it. And she helped me a lot with my writing. But she was a very gifted teacher and has been a wonderful partner for 43 years or so.
Wow. Was she also an Oberlin graduate?
No, we grew up in Oberlin. Our first date was due to the fact that I lost a flip of a coin. And another buddy and I were going to take out one of these two young women at Oberlin High School. And I lost the flip. He took the other gal. And I had a date with Janet under those circumstances. And it didn't work out for my friend. He married somebody else. But Janet and I dated from the year I was a junior and she was a freshman in high school. She was 2 years behind me. Through undergraduate into graduate school. And she went to Miami of Ohio and majored in English there. And when she graduated from Miami, I was entering my third year of the doctoral program at University of Southern California. So she and I got married as soon as she graduated, and she moved out to California with me.
Nice. Tell me, Scott, how did you find your way into kinesiology? Was there one person in particular that had an influence in that regard, or just tell me a little bit about that?
Well, it was not a direct line. My father, being in physical education, certainly had a huge influence on my love of sport and my love of things physical. But when I was at Oberlin, those first 2 years, I was majoring in religion. And after my sophomore year at Oberlin, I went to South America with a mission group to Brazil. And we spent the whole summer building homes in the favelas down in Rio de Janeiro. And, as I say, it was with a mission group, so we were with ministers and with other people of faith, and I was fully planning on going to seminary after I graduated from Oberlin and having a career in the ministry. But as I've told people, I had a conversion experience, or you might call it a reverse conversion experience in South America. It wasn't that I lost my faith, but I decided that my passion in life had to do with sport and with the kind of second-class citizenship that jocks and movement-related people often received. And so as I was down in South America with all these religious people and so forth, I remember that one night thinking in my bunk that I really need to go into sport philosophy and figure these things out about the mind-body problem and, how the intellect works in mere sporting activities and so forth. And so when I got back to Oberlin my junior year, I had to cram the major into 2 years, and I ended up graduating from Oberlin with a degree in physical education. And then I was looking around the country for people to study with, and there was Cy Kleiman at Ohio State, and Earl Ziegler at Illinois, and some people on the West Coast. But the person that got my attention was a woman named Eleanor Matheny.
Sure.
Because she was writing things that nobody else was writing. And I read some of her literature. I met her at the Chicago AFERD convention back in, must have been about 1966 or 67. And I was fascinated with her work. And then when I heard that a young buck named Howard Slusher was out at USC too, my mind was made up. All I had to do was talk them into accepting me, which they did. So there was really only one place I wanted to go, and that was to USC to study with Matheny and Slusher.
And tell me, was that a positive experience?
For the most part. Slusher's tenure in kinesiology was short-lived. Some historians know that when his book came out, Man's Sport and Existence, it was panned in Quest. And Jan Brokoff was the author of that review article that really devastated his book. And it, in my judgment, went a bit past devastating the book and got toward an ad hominem attack on Slusher himself. And it took the wind out of his sails. I was with him a day after he read the review, and he was almost a changed man, defeated. And it shocked me because he had so much bravado and so much intellect and inspiration. And, to hear him give a lecture, I just went out of his classes vibrating with ideas. And then to see him sitting back in his chair, mumbling to himself and saying, I can't believe that they published this review. It was really a shocking experience. So he ended up, my third year out there, second and third year actually, kind of withdrawing because he was studying law in preparation for his next career as a sport agent for athletes. And Eleanor Matheny was really the person who had the greater influence in the long haul. And, of course, she stayed in kinesiology until her retirement, and, of course, she's passed on now. But it was a great experience in that I can't imagine being with two livelier, more creative minds than Slusher and Matheny. So I have not grown anywhere close to that speed before or after my 3 years at USC.
I'm curious about Howard Slusher. He did become a sports agent?
He did become a sport agent. And he was a very aggressive type. I had a very unusual experience in what was then physical education because everybody knew my dad. He wrote quite a bit for a person at that time, so he was in the literature, and a number of people around the country knew him very well. And a couple of those people warned me that I should not study with Howard Slusher. So I'm not sure how Howard managed to burn so many bridges so quickly in his career, because I think he was in his mid-30s when I studied with him. He was a young guy. But, people, I think, for right or for wrong, felt that he was a little bit too much oriented around Slusher. Funny story with my mother, my sainted mother, the artist and piano player. She came out to visit me at USC, and Howard was taking her around campus, and Janet and I were walking behind and so forth. And after talking for a while, sort of personally with Howard, and I'm sure he said things like I was the best student he had ever had and all of those kinds of things. She said to us around the pool that evening, "Scott, I do not like that man." So my mother weighed in too. But Howard and I got along fine, and he stayed with me to the end. He was there for my dissertation defense. And he and I have communicated a couple of times since I left SC, and he's working for Nike, and as far as I know, he's still working for Nike. And he was a very stimulating teacher, and as you know, he was in the existential school of thought, and he was writing things that nobody had written before. About the values of movement, the nature of sport, and the kind of impact it has on human life. So I have no regrets for my studies out there, and I think I got a very good and stimulating 3 years of education.
Now, was Eleanor Matheny just as stimulating in the classroom?
Oh, she was fantastic. Yeah, she was quite an individual, and one of the things that I think has affected my thinking, I didn't know it when I was with her, but in looking back on the things I've written and studied since then, is she came out of biology and physiology herself.
Yes.
And at a certain point, when she was a young woman, she came to the realization that those disciplines did not give her answers to the real questions that she had. And so she was a self-made philosopher, a self-taught philosopher, and her patron saint was Ernst Cassirer, the great philosopher of symbolism. And so that was her stimulation and her reason for being. And in her classes, she was trying to teach us the gradations of intelligence that we find in different forms of intelligent life. I don't think she included plants in that, but she started with lower animals and talked about how intelligence expresses itself. Cassirer did this too.
Right.
And then when we got to the human level, some of the differences in kind that we saw with the breakthrough of human intelligence, early forms of human intelligence. And in my last 10 years of research, we might talk about that a little later, evolutionary theory and the keys to the developing human intellect have fascinated me. And my own theories have to do with the role that games and play may have played in that evolutionary process. But that was Matheny, not Schlescher. Schlescher wasn't interested in Darwin and evolution. He was interested in Sartre and Marcel and you know, people like that, and living the authentic life. Howard was the man of authenticity. What is it like to live an authentic life as a sports person? Matheny was interested in intellect, symbolism, and meaning, and why movement. You know, one of her phrases was, you know, how movements mean. And so she was interested in nonverbal intellectual behavior. And she was way, way ahead of her time.
Well, I'm curious, Scott, about what other graduate students were there at USC at about the same time?
Well, there were a few that went into sport philosophy, but none of them that really embraced it like myself in the sense of identifying solely with that area. Darlene Kelly was there. Bill Harper, who's at Purdue now and has written quite a bit, was there. Harper and I actually were tethered at the hip, and we went through the program at the same time. And one of the interesting historical facts is that Matheny and Schlescher didn't get along very well. And when Bill and I showed up out there, Bill was from California, what was then San Fernando Valley State College. And I came out from Oberlin. And I never saw Bill's scores, but he was brighter than hell. So I think he must have had really top scores. And I came out with the Oberlin pedigree. Matheny was on sabbatical. We didn't even meet her out there. And Slusher sort of met us at the USC gates and said, "You two fellows will be my advisees." And Harper and I looked at each other. We hadn't even been on campus for 2 days. And Slusher had said, "Well, obviously, you two guys will be my advisees, so let's sit down and talk about your program."
Oh, that's fun.
Well, Matheny shows up a year later. She was gone on a whole year sabbatical writing her book, Movement and Meaning.
Right.
And so she shows up the next year, and these two young bucks, Harper and myself, are there. We're under Slusher's wing, and he wasn't going to share us. And so that only, put fuel on the fire that I learned later was already burning between Slusher and Matheny. And I guess it says a little bit about Slusher too.
Right.
So we had some interesting difficulties, I guess you would say, with Matheny during those early years, where she was worried that, we liked Howard, we didn't like her. We thought his philosophy was a cat's meow. We didn't like her philosophy at all, which wasn't true. But I think we got caught up a little bit in their feud.
Right.
And so she took it out a little bit on Harper and myself. But Eleanor and I had a wonderful relationship.
Good.
And I walked into my dissertation defense literally shaking because I thought this might be the time where she goes after me. And, I heard stories about how grad students were sacrificed on the altar of, faculty disputes. But she was a model citizen. She was wonderfully supportive. And I, got through my dissertation defense without a wrinkle. And she and I communicated for many years after I left USC. And I got a chance to tell her before she died how much she meant to me and the importance of her philosophy in my development. So it was gratifying that we got to the point where we connected.
Now, was USC her last academic position?
Yes.
Okay.
I think my yes answer is pretty firm. I don't think she did a guest, or a visiting professorship anywhere. She and Eileen Lockhart knew each other well, and I know Eileen left for, I think it was North Texas, and did a short stint there. And I can't say for 100% sure that Eleanor didn't go there for a semester or something, but I'm pretty sure that Matheny's and Elfeld, who was a person she wrote with, who was in dance and philosophy, that they stayed at USC, and that was the end of their career.
Now, wasn't is it Elwood Craig Davis? Was he at USC about that time?
Before that.
Before
so
that.
I went to USC in 1966, the fall of '66, and he was already gone. Although I got to know him because I think he was teaching part-time or full-time out at San Fernando Valley State. He was in the area.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And so when they would have USC gatherings, dinners, picnics, he was always there. And so I met him on numerous occasions. And Bill Harper, the fellow who went through with me at USC, was actually a co-author on Davis's famous philosophy book.
Yes.
So I think Davis and Harper knew each other out at San Fernando.
Tell me, Scott, a little bit about your various academic positions that you've held over the years, and if you could just talk about length of time at each institution.
Out at when I was at Southern Cal, Harper and I went to Boston to the convention, and we were going to come back with big-time jobs. We were both married. We returned from Boston. Neither of us had any job. He had one interview. I had none. And so this was in April. That fall, we're supposed to be gainfully employed. I went up to Santa Barbara to apply for a position that was really in pedagogy, not sport philosophy. They wanted somebody to visit practice teachers. They offered me the position and said that I could work into the philosophy and develop that as a graduate concentration. I turned them down without another job in hand. Howard Slusher nearly killed me and said, you know, I've been working with you for 3 years, and you turned down a job at
Santa Barbara.
Santa Barbara. Are you crazy? People would kill to get a job at Santa Barbara. I didn't want to be on the West Coast, and I didn't much like the people I interviewed with out there. And so I told my wife, trust, we'll get a job. So I went to Emporia, Kansas for 2 years.
Okay.
Bill Harper and I went together, actually, and so we shared the philosophy courses. Bill stayed there, I think, for about 5 years before he went to Purdue. And I went to Brockport with Warren Fraley.
Okay.
Warren knew my dad very well, and he was like a surrogate father for me. And he's a very well-known person in philosophy circles.
Sure.
And I felt it was just an absolute privilege to be invited and recruited to teach at Brockport with him as the dean. So I went to Brockport. Eventually, I stayed there 13 years. It was a good place to cut my teeth. I'm not a fast learner, and I needed some time to have a little less pressure, so I didn't have to publish 8 articles a year. I could only publish 4 a year at Brockport and get tenure. And I think it was a smart move because Janet and I were growing a family. I coached our kids in all the sports, and I had enough freedom to be a person instead of just a grind. And the last 3 years at Brockport, I was department head.
Okay.
And that turned out to be important because after 13 years, I felt I wanted to have doctoral students. And it's hard to move as a sport philosopher, especially to an R1 school. So the administration turned out to be my ticket to Penn State because they were looking for a department head in 1984. And I went to Penn State as a full professor and as a department head in January of '84. I served as department head for 6 years. I decided that I really wanted to do research and teaching, and I hadn't done much with my doctoral program because we had a faculty then of about 70 people, counting all of our campuses around the state. So I had something more like a dean's job than a department head's job. Plus we had Dorothy Harris and Ellsworth Buzzkirk and, you know, a who's who list of very senior people. I was 39 years old and wet behind the ears, came from Brockport, not an R1 school, and Dick Nelson, all these famous people at Penn State, Bob Christina. So I had my hands full. So I didn't do much with the doctoral program those 6 years that I was department head. So I went back to the faculty around 1990, geared up my doctoral program, went back and did another year of department heading in between department heads. I had a position as chair of the faculty senate here at Penn State. I just finished a 10-year term as a faculty athletic rep at Penn State. So Penn State's been a good place. It's like a lot of people say, it's fun if you can stay at a school and new opportunities keep coming through the door. And I can say I haven't been bored. So I've had a wonderful run here at Penn State. I'm hoping to have a few more years. I've had tremendous luck with attracting good graduate students and having these other opportunities with athletics and with faculty governance and some other things across campus. So it's been a good place. So I've been at Penn State now 27 years.
Wow, it's hard to believe. And your plan is to, I think you mentioned this to me before, but your plan is to, for you and your wife to retire at Penn State?
Yeah, our roots are in Northern Ohio, and my minister brother, the comedian, lives in Northern Ohio. Janet's sister, my wife's sister, lives in the Oberlin area, and we have a cottage on Lake Erie. But our roots are in State College now, and I have a lot of good friends here, and we love the theater, the music, the athletics, our bridge friends, and so we're planning to retire in State College, and we may or may not have another place in Ohio that we visit when the weather permits.
Scott, you've during your career you've published extensively. in a variety of different venues. Can you talk a little bit about which publications you're most proud of and why?
Wow, that's a tough question. You know, you're inclined to cite those articles that have had the biggest impact on the field, but you know, that have been adopted by anthologies and that people have said, you know, have made a big difference in how they think. But I don't know. I think some of those that I'm proudest of are ones that aren't necessarily acknowledged by people. And one of those would be an article I wrote for the Journal of Philosophy Sport, Normative Heights of and Depths of Play. And in that article, I argue for this evolutionary theory that I mentioned to you earlier about our ancestors, our human predecessors, and how they move through the intellectual tasks of playing and then playing games, and what the intellectual move was from the former to the latter. And, you know, one of the things that I found absolutely fascinating and exciting about research in human evolution is that nobody knows how the Great Leap Forward, as it's called, happened.
Right.
You know, something happened 30, 35,000, 40,000 years ago. People dispute the time period, but the heat got turned up, or you know, the pedal got pushed to the floor, and we went from you know, pre-human existence or something that didn't resemble us that closely to an existence that included culture. And as you know, the cave paintings in France and around the world, and burials with symbolic trinkets and so forth. And something happened culturally 30 to 40,000 years ago, or roughly in that period. And I've always been impressed by the argument that games are a form of culture. And some of my research has looked at what kind of intellectual requirements do games impose on us? How did our ancestors have to think in order to negotiate games? And if I'm right, and this is really far out speculation, but if I'm right, one of the early inroads our ancestors made to culture per se might have been through games. And I don't think that it was a lockstep, that games came first, that painting came second, that music came third. But I think that there probably was some kind of graduated movement into culture. Most of the stuff I've read about verbalization suggests, excuse me.
Sure.
I get excited when I talk about this thing, and then I start coughing. Suggests that language, formal language, came relatively late. And you know, the digs and the artifacts that show anything that looks like a formal systematic language is relatively recent, at least compared to the cave paintings and other forms of symbolism. So I think there was probably a graduation into culture per se. The big $60,000 question is, what came first, or what were the early forms of culture? Or another way to put it is, what kinds of cultural events required less intellectual sophistication so that our ancestors could get into those forms of behavior? So I think that article is one place where I flesh that out, and I do it in a couple of other articles, but nobody picks up on that, because all of the theoreticians in anthropology who are talking about the Great Leap Forward jump from cave paintings to language. And it's sort of like they need a big pogo stick to do that.
But not games.
But yeah, they don't want to hear anything about games. I've submitted a couple of articles to highfalutin anthropology journals, and you know, they don't like the idea. It's not down their bailiwick. It doesn't flatter human beings
Right.
enough.
Right.
You know, it's got to be language, damn it. And it's almost as if they're sure that they have the answer. Now they just have to
Uh-huh.
find the evidence to,
Right.
you know, nail down the fact that somehow excess population led to overcrowding, led to a need to communicate, led to language. And, you
Right.
know, they make these kinds of plausible
Leap.
just so stories. And they say the stories almost always end with, so there had to be language. And I develop a story that says, so there had to be games.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And they don't like that story because it isn't flattering enough, and they would never want to admit that anything like basketball had anything to do with our human evolution.
Right. 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 Well, I find it interesting that you would mention. I feel the same way about some of my own work. You know, that some of the things that I'm most proud of are not always the pieces that people know a whole lot about.
Yeah.
I think that's probably typical of many of us academicians.
Yeah, we come up with a really cool idea, but it's too cool. Or at least in our own minds, we'd like to think that my idea may be a bad one. I'm sure you've had a lot of better ones, but in our own minds, we have these dreams that someday people will agree with that. We may not be here, but someday somebody will say, boy, that guy who talked about games being a doorway to evolution and culture, he was on the right track. So only in my dreams.
Are there any other ones that come to mind specifically?
Well, I've been very interested in our profession and how it's evolved and, you know, how it's grown. And so I've given a couple talks about the shape of our field. I'm frustrated with what I call the silos. So I gave a paper on silos and bunkers.
Yes.
And it frustrates me that here at Penn State, for example, the physiologists don't talk to the sociologists. The historians don't talk to the biomechanists. But we're all trying to figure out human movement.
Right.
And the philosophers that I studied with, Merleau-Ponty, or not with, but I learned from, John Dewey, William James, they saw human existence as continuous from cell level kinds of stuff to the most highfalutin ideas that humans can come up with. They didn't see any breaks in the action, as it were. And they didn't have all the answers to how this sort of scheme worked, but they were holists. They weren't mind-body dualists. And so it frustrates me that we have these little silos or enclaves of research, and we write to our little journals, and we speak to people who only know the language that we know. And I know that physiological insights should impact the kind of philosophy that I do. And conversely, I believe at least that the kinds of insights I come up with as a philosopher should impact the kind of research that physiologists do. And I think a lot of the new research is bearing this out, where, you know, genetic expression, how do genes get turned on and turned off? Well, it's hard to find total answers to those kind of questions at the microscopic level. You got to go at the organism at other levels to answer questions about turning off and turning on genes. Well, that gets all of us into the ball game then. And,
well, what do you think? What do you think the creation of silos, is that, at least in kinesiology, is that reflective of the creation of silos outside of our field? Is that just reflective of what's taking place in society more generally?
Yeah, it is, and I think it's reflective of our field as being a wannabe field. You know, we evolved from phys ed, teacher preparation, prior to Franklin Henry, where, and this was my dad's life too when he taught at Oberlin. He was educated at Columbia as a physical educator, and it was assumed that everybody would go into teaching or coaching. And so, you know, this new ball game of kinesiology and being real scholars in the real disciplines, I think had a lot to do with the fact that we worked very hard at being, in my case, a good philosopher. And, you know, you're a terrific historian. And Larry Kenney here at Penn State is a terrific physiologist. And we have to compete with the people in the home disciplines.
Sure.
So the journal I publish in has a nice mixture of kinesiologists and parent discipline philosophers. And we're flattered by that people who are what I call real philosophers look at my work and say, that's acceptable, it should go in the journel. So I think our wannabe history of sort of Operation Bootstrap, we had to get better quickly.
Right.
And now we're recognized by the NRC. So we're there.
Right.
We made it.
Right.
We did it.
So what?
So what? We have to communicate with each other because what we're about is changing lives, right, for the better.
Right. Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so we have all this status, but we still can't talk with one another. So I think the future is in cross-disciplinary research. And a lot of my graduate students here at Penn State, I get into physiology classes, and I have one of those folks on their doctoral committee. I had a student recently do a dissertation on performance enhancement, and he worked with Jim Pawelczyk here, who teaches a doctoral level course on the physiology of performance enhancement, really advanced stuff.
Very
and he knows that. My graduate student who graduated last year knows that stuff from top to bottom, but he knows all the philosophic arguments too about performance enhancement and fair play and human rights and whether or not they should be able to make choices for using steroids or not.
Right. Right.
So he's the kind of embodiment of the new philosopher that I picture. So I have to walk the walk that I'm talking about here. Is I should be training people who know physiology or who know biomechanics, at least enough to know the literature and know the lingo and have it influence the way they do philosophy and hopefully do it better because of it. So I think that's our future, and I hope future kines departments break down the silo walls and embrace that kind of idea. So some of the writing I've done in that way, I did another paper on jigsaw puzzles and riverbanks, which kind of the jigsaw puzzle being what I called interdisciplinary research, where we each do our research separately and then we try to put the puzzle pieces together later. Right. And I spoke against that. And the riverbanks, the metaphor I used there was ambiguous water, where the cell level research is upstream and the whole person research is downstream, and it's still all ambiguous water. And so that binds us together, and that we shouldn't be thinking in these separate compartments. And at the start of our research, we should be communicating, not at the end of our research.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, this is actually, Scott, a kind of a nice lead-in for one of my last questions, and that is, what do you consider to be the key events in kinesiology over the last 40 years or so?
Well, I think one of the key events I mentioned is the NRC recognition.
Okay.
Because I live in an R1 school, and my answer to this question would be very different than somebody who's in a state university. But at an R1 school, NRC means a lot. And here at Penn State, the fact that we were ranked #1, or depending on how you interpret those data, ranked near #1, that hit the presses here at Penn State, and it had an impact with everybody from the president through the provost and the dean, that they had a department here that was at the top of the heap. So that's a big event if you're talking about playing the research game and getting status and recognition as a bona fide contributor to human knowledge. So I think that's a watershed event. I also like the fact that the Academy has become much more proactive over the last 10 years. Some people would go to those meetings early on when I was a newly elected fellow and say, this group doesn't do anything. It's kind of nice to get together and smile at one another and say, isn't it nice we're fellows in the academy, but it isn't having an impact. And I think now it is, with its ranking of graduate programs and its talk about white papers and other kinds of activities. And I'm delighted that the leaders in kinesiology, and these are leaders across the disciplines, are stepping up and being more aggressive in caring about our field to make sure it thrives.
Yes,
so those are two popular things. I think a third thing is the rise of cross-disciplinary research. I don't think it's hit kinesiology much yet, but I see glimmers of hope that it is going to hit us, and I think that we'll see much more collaboration within kinesiology. And we have a big advantage in our field because we're all in the same department. Well, it's an advantage if we don't kill each other first. You know, we're right next door to people who do research very different than our own, whereas people in the rest of the university have to walk to another building to find somebody like that. So, you know, we've got a built-in advantage, and my fondest dream would be we're one of the leaders in the university in cross-disciplinary research. And of course, universities are putting together, you know, all kinds of cross-disciplinary units now that are thematic. But we've got to build in. We have a thematic unit. We're about human movement or physical activity or whatever terms you want to use for that. We're all together. I think one of the things that bothers me at this time, the last 20 years, is demise of the graduate programs. It breaks my heart that Washington no longer exists, that Arizona State no longer exists, that Berkeley no longer exists, that USC, for all intents and purposes, no longer exists.
University of Oregon.
University of Oregon, and these were solid, well-known programs that had some of our top researchers, and they disappeared. And I don't know whether that's means that we're going to totally disappear 20 years from now, or whether we need to reinvent ourselves in some way. I don't have good crystal ball here in my office, but it worries me. And a related issue has to do with the humanities in kinesiology. When I started as a doctoral level professor, there were 3 or 4 places in the country that I could advise people to go to do philosophy of sport. Now there's one. For better or for worse, here at Penn State, that is really geared up to do doctoral level education. And I'm a believer in the whole spectrum of research, that if we're going to solve human problems, we need to have everybody at the table, from cell level to philosophy. And I worry that for a variety of reasons, I don't think it's been a plot to get rid of all of us historians and philosophers. I think it's been partly an accident of the economics of the time, where department heads wanted to hire people who could get big grants. And traditionally, you and I and others in our area have not been big grant getters. And so it's not that they said, I don't want a philosopher. It's that they say, I do want somebody who can bring in money. But you know, I think deans and department heads need to be making decisions for other reasons. And to keep their faculty balanced. So I worry about that.
Absolutely. Scott, anything else that you'd like to mention or to discuss?
Well, nothing. I'm delighted that you you know, asked me to do this interview, and for people who might be hearing this a few years from now, just say that, you know, kinesiology is a wonderful profession. Sport, games, and play are some of the best subject matter anybody could ever hope to have. And I smile every time I think about, you know, future studies, future research, and the kinds of things people will discover in the future. So it's for any young people who might be listening to this tape in the future, stay in kinesiology. It's a great field.
Absolutely. Well, listen, Scott, it's been thanks so much for the interview. It's really been a nice opportunity for me to talk to you. And actually, I've learned a lot this afternoon that I didn't know. By the way, I think it's I was thinking about a young boy from Oberlin being in Los Angeles. That must have been a bit of a cultural shock, I assume. To
The smog was the biggest problem. I drove into this cloud coming down from Santa Barbara or wherever it was from the north, and I hit this cloud that I later learned was smog, and it didn't smell very good, and I tried to hold my breath. And I figured out that holding my breath for 3 years wasn't going to work. So,
I'm also struck. I'm the one thing I was thinking about as you were talking about Eleanor Matheny and Howard Slusher and the like, and USC. I think it's so ironic that what has happened is we now have yet another, what I think is of as another great philosopher of sport who is now at USC, and that's Bill Morgan.
Bill Morgan.
But yet Bill doesn't find himself in a department of kinesiology.
I've been bugging him to move over there and reinvent that department, and he says he's a persona non grata, and that they, I guess, do physiology or something, and that it's not a place where he could live.
Yes.
So it is ironic, because there's nobody better than Bill Morgan in sport philosophy, and he's at USC, and the ghosts of Slusher and Matheny are there, but Bill's not in a position where he can do much of anything.
No, and that's too bad. He's got so much, so much to offer, and could be a valuable assistance, I think, to the folks there. But
well, I'm going to be pushing the academy in the years ahead, God willing, that I can attend a few more meetings to become a little bit more aggressive in keeping the breadth of our field intact. And as you know, sitting in the room at some of those meetings are the movers and shakers, including the administrators of some of our best schools.
Sure.
And they're the ones who have their fingers on the purse strings and can make decisions that, by God, we're going to hire a sport philosopher. And keep that part of the research agenda alive.
Absolutely. Irrespective of how much external grant money can be brought in.
That's right. Money counts, but it doesn't count for everything.
Absolutely. Hey, Scott, thanks so much, and I will be talking to you shortly.
Thank you very much, David. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Great questions, and thanks again.
And have a good day, and we'll talk soon.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.